The final phase has officially begun in the crypto market, and Bitcoin is doing exactly what it needs to do and exactly what it has always done. We discussed in the last update video that Bitcoin would very likely find support in this gray box, and that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment. But what this chart is all about and much more, we'll discuss in today's video. Once again, I've prepared quite a bit for you. We'll also take a look at what's happening behind the scenes. I've really put together some new charts and new data for you. It's definitely extremely important to pay attention to what's really happening in the background right now, because I know, of course, on the one hand, the crypto market is currently very boring, very sluggish, not much is happening, but especially now, it's extremely important to stay on top of things and keep preparing for the coming weeks, because now more than ever, it's crucial to have a solid foundation and a clear roadmap, and that's exactly the roadmap I want to give you in today's video. What is my approach now? What new data has come in? And based on that, we'll work out a clear roadmap here so you get a concrete insight into what my approach is now. I've also prepared some new trades here, and at the end of the video, we'll briefly talk about the trading bots again because quite a bit has happened there in the last few days. It's definitely going to stay extremely exciting. Otherwise, a quick apology for not having recorded an update video for 13 days, but let's be honest, not much has really happened on the chart. It's been pretty boring over the last few days, and one thing I should mention, I was traveling personally. I was at the event in Dortmund, and it was definitely a lot of fun. It was definitely also really cool to finally meet all the other YouTubers in person. I can honestly only say positive things about it. Everyone was super chill, I have to say. It was a really cool event, and I even had a little speaking appearance there. You can definitely check it out on Kevin's channel. I also posted about it in my Telegram group, just so you know in case you're interested. Otherwise, you were definitely kept up to date with the altcoin update videos or the altcoin ranking. But now, from this point on, things will continue as usual with update videos so that you're kept informed with a clear roadmap. Right now, it's especially important to have a clear thread running through your own strategy. And it's particularly important to me to communicate all of this clearly in the YouTube videos. So here's a quick recap of the last video. I mentioned there that I believe a bottom could be forming here with Bitcoin because we keep seeing exactly the same pattern repeating itself. Since the bear market bottom, we've basically seen Bitcoin form a stair-step upward movement with new highs each time, followed by an ultimate liquidity flush downward where all market participants, all the weak hands, are shaken out. And this systematic redistribution of wealth keeps happening with Bitcoin. We saw it during the summer lull of 2024, we saw it during the April crash, and exactly the same thing happened again here in June. And exactly the same thing has happened here again. At this point, in my opinion, it's incredibly obvious what keeps happening with Bitcoin. And here we can take a look inside June 27, 2025. Here too we can take a look at the fear and greed index. At that point we were once again briefly in the fear zone, so now here too because of this sell-off. And as I said, it's always exactly the same thing over and over again. I also pointed this out in the last video. It was also incredibly exciting to take a look here using on-chain data, and we could see very clearly that especially the weak hands, meaning the newcomers, the rookies in the market, are systematically shaken out here. They get scared, sell their Bitcoin, and as I said, this becomes apparent here as well through on-chain data, which is why the signs were already relatively obvious. So here you definitely have a brief recap. That's why at the moment things are looking very good in my opinion. We still have a beautiful overall upward structure in Bitcoin on a 3-day basis. And by the way, we can also take a look at this on a weekly basis. I think many of you, or at least the loyal viewers among you, definitely know or recognize this chart. Here we have Bitcoin shown in a broader context on a weekly basis. What you can also see quite clearly here is that we got perfect support at my own indicator. As I said, the Vincent Momentum Band here is basically a kind of bull market support band. That's how you can look at the whole thing in a broader sense. We can clearly see that even here in June, when this crash happened, we also got nice support on a weekly basis. And now, once again, right here. This indicator is definitely a nice point of reference. In this case, I've set it to 150 periods, just so you know, so the length is set to 150. In case you're wondering, or just so you're aware, everyone who is in my free Telegram group definitely gets access to both indicators. So you're definitely covered there. I've definitely linked it in the video description. So if you don't have this indicator yet on TradingView, it's definitely worth it. As I said, it's completely free. That's all there is to say about that for now. What currently only looks mediocre, and this needs to be clearly mentioned, is the resistance above us. Specifically, we have a contact point here. Bull market highs in 2017, 2021, 2022, and now once again. So it's actually a resistance or support level, depending on the situation, where Bitcoin is positioned and which has always been respected. Unfortunately, we've now dipped below it in the short term on a weekly basis. That's why it's especially important this week for Bitcoin to climb back up to prices of 113,000, 114,000 US dollars. Then the whole thing can definitely be considered a kind of fake out. As I said, it's very typical for Bitcoin that individual fake outs keep happening. But what absolutely must not happen now, what would definitely be very critical for Bitcoin, is if something like this happens. If we encounter resistance here and Bitcoin gets sold off again down to 100,000 US dollars. That would definitely not be nice to see. In that case, this level absolutely has to hold, but to be honest, I'm not worried about that at the moment, because right now, everything is going according to plan. At the moment, everything looks very, very clean, and as long as the structure here remains clear, there's really no reason to worry. As I said, we'll talk more specifically about liquidity heat maps at the end of the video and what a possible outcome could be at this point in time, but as mentioned, more on that towards the end of the video. Otherwise, there's one more thing we definitely need to pay attention to. Historically, September is the worst month. I also mentioned this here 2 weeks ago in one of my YouTube videos. Of course, this doesn't necessarily have to happen, but historically we have to assume that September is a bit more boring and that we can expect stronger performance in Q4. We can also see that, as of now, September is still green. It definitely doesn't look that bad. There's actually a reason for that. We're about to talk about that now. We'll also be getting very specific about my roadmap. As far as September, October, and November are concerned, because things will definitely get especially interesting then, since we have important data coming up. First, I'd like to briefly touch on the topic of global liquidity, because right now we're seeing a slight decoupling. We've now reached new highs in global liquidity, while at the same time Bitcoin has been sold off. What's happening with Bitcoin right now is actually very, very unusual, both in terms of global liquidity and in relation to the traditional markets. So let's take a look at that as well. Here we can see the S&P 500, which is hitting one all-time high after another. And as we all know, there is currently a correlation of 80% between Bitcoin and the S&P 500. That is truly an extremely, extremely high value at the moment. And that's why it's especially interesting to observe that the S&P 500 is reaching one all-time high after another, standing very, very strong right now, while Bitcoin is almost being artificially suppressed. So Bitcoin is clearly lagging behind at the moment, both in terms of the traditional market and global liquidity, because according to global liquidity, we should actually be much higher already. That's why these are definitely important indicators we need to pay attention to. That's why I personally am definitely bullish, or at least much more positive, because we have tailwinds from global liquidity. We also have tailwinds from the S&P 500, because one thing I can tell you, also speaking from experience, most of the time when there's a slight decoupling here, it's usually only short term, and sooner or later, Bitcoin catches up with the traditional market again. So things like this happen, and the S&P 500 keeps moving ahead as well. Of course, this also requires that the traditional market continues to reach new all-time highs. But if this is the case, Bitcoin will also continue to expand its upward trend. So I would be extremely surprised if the traditional market keeps hitting new all-time highs and Bitcoin somehow enters a bear market now. That just makes no sense to me personally. Because we also have to keep in mind that more and more institutions are buying up Bitcoin. This means that the general investors partially overlap between the traditional market and Bitcoin. So we have some of the same investors who invest in both stocks and Bitcoin, and that's why it's a logical conclusion that Bitcoin will follow suit. In my view, it's also a logical conclusion that new liquidity is the fuel for rising prices. It's practically like the fuel tank for a car, and it's the same with Bitcoin and global liquidity. That's why I personally still believe that Bitcoin will sooner or later reach new all-time highs in September or October, because we can clearly see here as well that global liquidity is reaching new record levels. We are now seeing a slight stagnation in global liquidity here, but that's not particularly bad. I would be more concerned if something like this happened, but at the current moment, we're actually seeing a slight new all-time high. So things definitely don't look bad at all when it comes to global liquidity. That's why I personally also believe that the cycle could easily last until the end of 2025, maybe even into the first quarter of 2026. I can well imagine that the cycle will be somewhat extended. That's definitely my current plan, my approach. This also fits very well with the current central bank policy decisions. So we can clearly see here that we've already priced in several new rate cuts. In fact, right now there's even an 8% probability that a double cut will take place. In this case, September 17th will definitely be extremely interesting. Personally, I don't expect a double cut to happen, but it's still positive to see that quite a bit is being priced in here, which will logically benefit all risk-on assets, and that in turn will have further effects. So just to explain briefly here, we can expect a weakened US dollar as a result. If several rate cuts are introduced again, it's only logical that it becomes much easier for all companies to take out new loans, which of course leads to a general weakening of the US dollar, and we will see similar behavior as during the bull runs of 2017, 2018, and 2021. We've seen the same pattern over and over again in those times. Whenever cheap money enters circulation, it's only logical that the US dollar gets weakened. We see a weakening here and a weakening there. Up to now, this has always led to the risk-on lever really being pulled. We've seen it time and again. If we overlay Bitcoin here, we can see a strong bull run in 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2021. It's really always the same pattern, and we can see it again right now with a clear weakness emerging here. We have actually been in this risk-off phase for quite a long time now, during which it was extremely difficult for cryptocurrencies to deliver good performance. Of course, it's also obvious, with a strong US dollar, investors aren't really willing to move their capital around. But especially when the US dollar is extremely weak, it's only logical that all the investors would rather put their dollars into stocks or cryptocurrencies. This is actually the same behavior we keep seeing over and over again. That's why at the moment things really don't look so bad. As I said, here you have an overall overview. That's why I'm relatively relaxed at the current time. At the moment, there's really no reason to panic as long as the structure remains intact and as long as we keep getting good data, everything is still in the green. Otherwise, one thing we can take a quick look at is the current correlation with gold. It's definitely, I would say, interesting to observe that we have a slight lead from gold here. We've also repeatedly observed that when gold reaches new all-time highs, new record levels, there's a kind of time lag of about 200 days, after which Bitcoin tends to follow suit. To be completely honest with you, I'm always a bit cautious with such data because you should never rely on it one-to-one. You can never say exactly, based on a template, what Bitcoin will do in the future, but it's still a positive indication that Bitcoin could reach further record highs here as well. Because as you can see from historical data, Bitcoin has always reached new highs sooner or later. Provided, of course, that gold also continues its rally. As I said, I wouldn't be too strict here and expect it to match exactly one-to-one as in this template. So please always be cautious about what gets posted on Twitter. But still, as I said, it's another indicator among many that works in our favor regarding the overall roadmap. That's all I have to say about that for now. Now I want to get a bit more specific, a bit more concrete regarding Bitcoin at the moment. What are my trades doing? What about my positions? And of course, my plan for the coming days. So I'll definitely move the face cam for this. Here, we can take a look at the liquidity heat map over 3 days. On a daily basis, quite a bit has built up below us at $110,000, which is why I've actually opened some new long positions at this point. I've also already closed out some long positions. Just so you know, I had built up new long positions here, exactly in this gray box, as I also communicated on Telegram. So everyone who is in my trading Telegram group was definitely able to take advantage of this trade very, very well. We really hit this very, very precisely because there was quite a bit of liquidity here. I also posted that I went long here at 108,000 US dollars. So in this case, I placed several orders between 180,500 and 108,000 US dollars. So I built up positions here again, some of which I have already closed out. That's why I'm going to build new positions here now due to the liquidity below us. That's definitely my current approach. We can also see here, which definitely benefits us, if we look at it on a monthly basis, there's quite a build-up above us. We see several billion in liquidity here, going up to actually 117, almost 120,000 US dollars. So overall, things are definitely looking more than good. And that's why, once again, a clear request to you, don't let yourselves get shaken out by the individual small market movements. So if we take a look here on a 3-day basis, yes, there's still liquidity below us at 110,000 US dollars. We can even take a look here on a 2-week basis, and we have to honestly keep in mind that there's still quite a bit sitting at 106,000 US dollars. Of course, it's questionable whether something like that will be picked up again, but please don't let yourselves get washed out of the market here. Even if such prices should occur again, they are just opportunities you can take advantage of because, as I said, everything is still intact on the larger scale, everything is still in place. As I said, in my opinion, I personally don't believe that prices like 100,000 US dollars or similar will happen again here. In my view, that's it now. So, the current counter movement that's happening right now, in my opinion, was this interim bottom, because everything here speaks for itself. The entire structure, the whole behavior of Bitcoin. So I can easily imagine that in the next few days, in the next few weeks, we'll get back up here to 115, 116, 117,000 US dollars. That would definitely be realistic. That's why I'm definitely positioned long. Just like, in fact, all the trading bots as well. As I said, they're all still set to long and they're working incredibly hard in the background. We can take a look at that here. It's actually extremely interesting if we take a look here at the details of the individual trading bots. As we know, I uploaded a new video here a few days ago. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I set up a total of 5 new trading bots. So we can take a look here at what has happened since then, so you get a mini update. Let's click on details. What I find particularly exciting here is that we can now compare 2 different values with each other in this case. We see the trend P&L. So what would have happened if we had just held Bitcoin basically without a trading bot? And we have to keep in mind, if we hadn't set up a trading bot, we would have taken a minus 1.4% loss on the overall position. That means I started the trading bot 2 weeks ago. If we take a look at the chart, I started the trading bot roughly here, around this level. And what has happened since then is basically nothing for Bitcoin. So if I had just bought and held Bitcoin, I actually would have made a loss. But thanks to the trading bot, because it keeps taking advantage of individual price drops to buy low and sell high, we have a grid profit of 4.7% here, a total of $117 that we were able to pocket, so to speak. And that's why the bot has actually managed to outperform the market here, thanks to the grid profit, as we can see here. That's why overall the trading bot is $81 in profit, which of course isn't a huge amount. But we have to keep in mind, the bot has only been running for 19 days, and if we had just held Bitcoin normally, we would actually be at a loss. So this is definitely a wonderful way to outperform the market, and we keep seeing that grid profit is definitely being generated. So the bots are really profitable, and I can clearly recommend them from my side. Because especially during boring market phases, you can still squeeze out quite a bit of capital. We can see it here with Bitcoin. Each individual price drop is always taken advantage of very neatly. Here, for example, on a daily basis, we can see the individual grids, and all the small sell-offs that took place were beautifully used to buy the lower Bitcoin falls, and as soon as there are individual pumps, it sells again. All of this is passively automated, and you can also see that the whole thing works. As I said before, for me personally, it was only important at the time that I didn't give any recommendations as long as I hadn't tested the bots myself, but now I can really say at this interim stage that it's definitely worth it. So it really does make sense to set up certain bots with a portion of your own capital because you can truly outperform the market. It should also be said that, in quotation marks, it's very, very beginner friendly. So if you've watched my YouTube videos here, you definitely also know how I set up all the trading bots. It's actually relatively simple once you understand how the bot works in the background, as I mentioned. That's why, of course, I'll keep you updated on this in the coming days and weeks. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss any more update videos from me. I think with today's YouTube video, you've gotten a good overview of what my personal roadmap is now. My personal approach is always extremely important to me to give you a clear thread to follow. A clear structure, which is exactly my approach, so that you definitely don't get sidetracked. Especially now in the final phase, this was extremely important to me. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and comment. With that, I sincerely thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again in the next YouTube video.